Hi, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, falling oil prices have shaken Venezuela's economy. We look at how Venezuelans are coping with food shortages and a deepening recession. So today we're linking the oil story of falling oil prices with the economy in Venezuela and also everyday people's lives. It is not an idea that we came up by ourselves. We had some help from our open editorial on Latin America. Malika?
Yes, we actually got this pitched several times by people during our Twitter chat and open editorial. So this one is out of the UAE actually. Gopi says, what impact will a decline on global oil prices have on Venezuela? And this next pitch came from Mexico City. They actually suggested two of our guests for today's show. So we'll talk to them in a bit, and we want your thoughts on this topic. You can tweet us with hashtag AJStream.
We always like a little booking help. Thank you very much, community, for that. In our studio, we have George Chicarello, Ma, and George is the author of We Created Chavez and Professor of Political Science at Drexel University. George, it's great to have you here.
Glad to be here again.
And we will hear more from you in just a moment.
Hi, I'm Oscar Guardiola. I'm a Latin American writer and I am in the stream.
Over the weekend, thousands of Venezuelans attended an opposition protest in Caracas, blaming government policies for their country's worsening economic crisis. They banged heavy pots to highlight the food shortages that they're facing. The falling global oil prices is hurting Venezuela's economy, which relies almost exclusively on oil production. Prices on goods have gone up across the board. Many Venezuelans are having to stand in line for hours outside supermarkets to get subsidized items like milk, soap and nappies or diapers. Now, President Nicolas Maduro, who has 22% approval rating right now, admitted that his country is in a crisis, but said his political foes are waging an economic war against his socialist government. But the opposition says the troubled economy is a result of years of corruption and misguided policies. So to help us discuss this, we're also joined by David Smaldy. He's a senior fellow at the Washington office on Latin America. David also moderates a blog on Venezuelan politics and human rights. Isabel Pisani is a student at Universidad Metropolitana. And Emiliana Duarte is a blogger at the Caracas Chronicle. So great to have you all here. Isabel, first of all, take me on a little shopping trip, the most recent shopping trip. How challenging was it?
Well, every day is challenging in order for us to buy the products that we need. In order for us to get milk, for example, at my house, I haven't found milk in a month or so I couldn't eat my cereal with milk in my mornings, okay? For example, my last trip with my grandmother, she tried to buy meat. There isn't any meat at the supermarkets right now. She had to practically bribe the attendant in order for her to get a kilogram of meat.
Right. Wow. Yeah, so your grandma is kind of pretty fierce. No milk for a month. How does that happen?
Well, because there aren't any private production here in the country, okay? The industries that did produce the milk were nationalized, most of them, okay? On the past years, more than 238,000 enterprises in Venezuela closed down. Private enterprises, and those were the ones that gave the products for the supermarkets. Now, if you find something, you probably will find one brand, and it's not necessarily the best brand or the brand that you will choose. So it's kind of a forced decision, the things that you're buying at the supermarket. It's what you can find. It's not what you want.
Sure.
There isn't any competition.
Right. So David, if you were trying to explain this to an outsider who goes along to the supermarket and pretty much finds what they want in a supermarket, how would you explain this?
Well, I think it's important to realize that scarcities are different than hunger. No, there's a big confusion. People think that people in Venezuela are hungry. Actually, there's very little hunger here. There's actually, consumption has been increasing over the past 10 years or so. What there are is scarcities, which mean you can't get what you want when you want it. No, so I went shopping with my family about 10 days ago, and we got all the fruits and vegetables we wanted. But we went to the meat section. There was no beef. There was no chicken. There were smoked pork chops. There was fish, and there was goat loin. And so now we're going to figure out how to cook goat loin.
Okay.
But there's food. We have food, and it's just not the food we wanted. It also means that we have to go shopping more frequently. We have to go a couple times a week. This is something that really disrupts the lives of middle-class people who are used to shopping once a week or once every other week, whereas poor people who tend to have more time than money are usually used to shopping several times a week. And so it just disrupts poor people less than middle-class people. So it's something that we hear about. Poor people deal with scarcities all the time because oftentimes, in most contexts,
it's a matter of social classes. I think this is generally a problem that doesn't just affect the middle class or that poor people are exempt from the hardships that we're going through. I know of people that sleep in front of supermarkets the night before for days even. I've seen mothers nurse their children in line under the sun, standing for 8 hours, waiting to see not if they can buy milk, but if they can buy anything. When you go up to someone in a line in front of a supermarket,
I think that's right. I think it's definitely affecting poor people more now than it did, say, 2 years ago. No, I mean the story for several years was the story that I just gave. Now I think the real problem the government has is really in the past 12 months, it is affecting poor people because it's affecting poor people in the basic goods that are controlled prices. And I think that's what's really hitting the popularity, Maduro's popularity, is that the scarcity has gotten to the point that they're really affecting poor people as much as middle class people.
Yes, take a pause for a moment because I want to bring in the community. So hold tight just for a second. Malika, what are you seeing online?
Well, people are talking about how it's affecting them. They're sharing their own personal take with this. So Teresa on Twitter says, inflation is making my life miserable, but the real pain is the food shortage. Lines are huge and people show their worst face in these lines. That's true. So there's this hashtag that's trending. This is a hashtag that translates in Spanish to empty shelves in Venezuela. And you see it here. You see the shelves. People are using that hashtag to take pictures of what they're seeing. But George, what do you make of these shortages, these empty shelves? Is this the worst that it's been?
Well, it's certainly not the worst that it's been, but we're certainly seeing a moment of heightened scarcity, as David said, in specific goods for specific periods of times. And the fact that you hear about the very same goods, often diapers, for example, powdered milk, really speaks to the fact that there are very specific sectors that these shortages are involved in. But we're talking about a systematic problem, not of this government, but of the Venezuelan system. We're talking about decades and decades of no stimulation for domestic production, in which an oil economy militates against and creates all of these disincentives that make it very difficult to produce domestically. And I think the government's response has been mixed, right? On the one hand, it's not simply a tragedy that private businesses are closing down. Many of them are closing down because they don't want to sell at the regulated prices, and the government regulates the prices because it believes that the people have a right to be able to eat meat and to eat chicken and to have access to milk instead of letting the market
George,
and the private sector set these prices.
You're chatting and Isabel's just like nodding her head violently and she's sitting in Caracas. So just hold that thought for a moment. Isabel, what's up? Why are you upset?
Okay, yes, you could say at first that there were some products that were missing, but now you see that you can find deodorant, you can find shampoo, you can find milk powder or liquid milk, you can find coffee or any product. I mean, it's generalized to every product that you need in the supermarket. It's not just one type of a specific product. It's not one brand specific. It's that you can find any brand of any of those products.
Okay.
And if you find it, it's rare for you to do so.
George.
See,
Well, that's simply, I mean, we can't generalize on the basis of one experience because people are getting milk and people are getting coffee and people are getting their household items every day and people are queuing up, and it's important to point out, often for things that have regulated prices. That means that because the government protects those prices, people are willing to wait in line to pay that regulated price to get those goods. People are also waiting in line today in Caracas for televisions, for refrigerators, and so we're talking about a situation that, as David said, is not one of the picture that's being painted internationally of sort of starvation and total, absolute lack.
Is it
See, here's the thing. I don't understand
Emiliana.
how minimizing the problem in any way adds to this conversation, other than the fact that maybe you're an agent of communism. Because honestly, the problem is the model, the system, and the system is specific to this government. And it's not me saying it. Last year, Jorge Jordani, the former finance minister of Chavez, published publicly in an op-ed. He confessed to having brought Venezuela to the brink of bankruptcy in order to use public funding for the re-election of Chavez. It's a matter of perpetuating themselves in power, using our oil money to do so, and in the meantime, destroying any shred of productivity this country ever had. And it wasn't always this way. And this is certainly the worst crisis we've ever lived through. And the worst part about it is that the government has not had a mixed response. It's had no response. And this is only going to get worse, David. It might not be a matter of hunger now, but maybe in 2 to 3 months, it very might will be.
Okay, so Emiliana, that was George actually speaking here in the studio. David is in Caracas, and now I'm going to go to the community. We're going to do a little round robin here and then come back to you all.
Right. Well, Emiliana said that it's only going to get worse, and so that begged a question that we're seeing from several people. It looks like this. Ashish says, I'm no economist, but what I want to know is why, amidst all of the other oil-dependent nations, this is hitting Venezuela quite so hard. I'd like your thoughts on that, David. What do you make of this person's question?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for the government's economic policies. I understand what they've tried to do. They've tried to increase consumption for poor people. That's admirable. But what they've done, they've basically fallen into all the classic traps of an oil economy. They've totally allowed the exchange rate to inflate. It's something that oil economies have a tendency to do. That has made this into a completely import-based economy. It's prevented for the private sector from growing. Private sector is actually contracted in most sectors. And so, of course, the current exchange rate is basically 25 times stronger than the black market rate. There's huge economic distortion.
So, David, what did you make of President Maduro going around the world getting some financial help, and he came back with some financial help as well? So he did do something.
I think that's logical. Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly what I would do as well. I mean, he's got to go around and try to get some funding. He's got to try and get something, because the drop in oil prices is just extraordinary. So, but that is just a stopgap. I mean, getting more funding is something that Venezuela needs, but it needs to take really significant measures to change the foreign exchange chaos and gas prices to really get a hold of what's going on in Venezuela. Otherwise, it's just going to kick the can down the road a little way.
So, and we have no idea what those measures are. I mean, December 30th, our president announced that he was going to announce measures in January. In January, he came on television saying he would announce them later. Then he left for 2 weeks on an open-ended trip while people were standing in line. And then he comes back for his unfortunate State of the Union address, in which he announced that he didn't have announcements to make.
Emiliana, this is
the Bermuda market, and he was going to do gas prices. I think actually he put forth some substantive ideas, at least as substantive as you ever hear in the State of the Union address.
But he's been talking about this
for he actually made concrete for that to work. But he actually did announce some measures that would work. If he could actually
by announcing measures,
that legal parallel market, that would actually alleviate the problem quite a bit.
All right, so David and Emiliana, this is what I've got back here, this President Maduro's plan from the State of Nations speech that was on January the 21st, I believe. So we've got a 15% hike in minimum wage, increase the price of gasoline, loosen restrictions on Venezuela's exchange rate, invest in scholarships and housing. Isabel, what do you make of that?
Yes, I agree with what David was saying regarding Maduro's trip that was strictly necessary for Venezuela's economy. Yeah, if I was the president right now, I would do exactly the same. Beg for the international community to help me for something that I cannot pay for myself. Because that's really the situation that's going on right now. The amount of debt it cannot be paid by the oil industry. Even if they invested the amount of money that they should invest in the oil industry, they couldn't. But regarding Maduro's recent policies, the 15% on minimum wage, it wouldn't help any housing. I mean, in my house, in order for you to buy food for 3 people for a month, it would be around 20,000 bolivars. And the minimum wage is around 5,600. It would be
it's 25 bolívares a day, Isabella. The wage increase amounts to 25 bolívares a day, which is not even enough to buy yourself a cup of coffee.
Which is not even enough to ride on public transportation.
Emiliana and Isabel, these scenarios that you're giving us, these examples, are exactly why people online are saying this is only going to hurt in the long run. This is not going to solve the problem. So, George, we got this Facebook comment from someone. I'll read this here from Fernando, and he says, Venezuela's ongoing economic collapse is a result of years of mismanagement. Our government didn't plan for a rainy day. They believe that high oil prices were here to stay. Do you think that's true?
I think that on the one hand, it's true that there was not enough planning. I'm not going to deny that there were major missteps by the Venezuelan government in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of a whole bunch of things. But we're also talking about, as I said, this is not a question of the regime. This is a question of the system. This is a question of the oil system. And we're talking about a country that has not produced enough domestically for decades and decades. And it's been always an importing economy. And the question is really now that import economy is really biting the government, because the government has to hand over dollars to private companies to import items. And when they don't give enough dollars, those companies shoot up the prices and they drive up the cost, or they withdraw items and they withhold them in warehouses until those are discovered, by the government in what Maduro is calling the economic war. And on top of that, you've got actually what is more.
This is a problem of hoarding. This is a problem.
Hoarding is a big part of it. There were just, I was just in Venezuela 2 months ago, and what everyone was lining up for were diapers. Last week they discovered 2.5 million diapers in a warehouse, and while Emiliana's blog is actually defending hoarding and claiming that it's not really hoarding, it's part of business as usual, people on the street are waiting in line for these very same diapers. Now, worse than the hoarding, though, is the smuggling across the border of gasoline, of food items, of many of these things that Venezuelans are waiting for, and that has to do with price controls. But there's this difficult balance where you agree that people need to be able to...
Slow down a second, because you're a professor and this is your territory. Mm-hmm. So I'm writing down hoarding, smuggling.
Sure.
This is why there are huge lines in Venezuela right now. You're saying these are the reasons.
Absolutely. This is a part of it.
Not socialism, not maybe the system maybe not working out.
Certainly not socialism, of course. And where I've been accused of being an agent of communism, and I will all sort of take that up gladly if we're talking about the communes in Venezuela, which are really the first real attempts to produce domestically and to produce in a radically democratic way in Venezuela, to produce what people need to distribute locally instead of importing everything from outside.
All right, so slow down a second. Take a breath. Ladies, one at a time. Let me go to Isabel first of all. Hoarding and smuggling is creating the problems that Venezuela is having right now, not the political situation.
Of course not. I mean, the government's policies on what's going on at the economy right now hasn't been really useful. For example, what you said, George, previously regarding the control of prices, and that the enterprises didn't want to sell the products on the controlled prices. Yes, they don't want to sell them because they can't even pay for the production of those products at the rate that they're trying to impose. That's why they close down. They cannot afford to even produce another line of that product at the price rate that they're trying to impose.
All right, so Isabel, because so many goods are actually subsidized, it doesn't make any business sense to sell them for the price the government says you have to sell them by, which means that then somehow the economic system of the country isn't working out enough for people to feel that they want the goods to be available for everybody. All right, let me go back to the community, Malika.
There's this question here on Facebook that people are looking forward, but this might be a slight exaggeration, so I actually would like your thoughts on this. So David on Facebook says, would it be possible to suggest the shortage will end as soon as Maduro is removed from office? So this is taking a look at people blaming Maduro for these policies. Will it just be done if he leaves office, David?
I think it'll be done with policies change. Whether or not it's Maduro in office, I really don't think that's what's going on. I mean, I think clearly contraband, sending things across the border into Colombia is a problem, but I think that's really a superficial sort of symptom of the real malady. If you look at the Venezuelan economy, it's basically stagnated. In fact, there's a 2.8% contraction and recession in 2014. Yet at the same time, the government is printing money, is printing inorganic money. So the monetary supply has increased by 66% in 2014, at the same time that the value in the economy has remained stagnant. Therefore, inflation is inevitable. If you add to that a fixed exchange rate, there's going to inevitably be pressure on foreign reserves. There's not going to be enough to import what the economy demands, at least at the prices that goods are available at, and you're going to get shortages. I really think with the current setup, economic contraction, expanding monetary supply, and a fixed exchange rate, I can't imagine not having inflation and scarcity. I can't even with a thought experiment. I can't imagine it.
Emiliana, how do Venezuelans get out of this situation?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that denying the obvious and placing the blame on external factors is this government's modus operandi. The first thing this government has to do is rectify. Back when we had blackouts, they blamed a lack of electricity on an iguana, and they're blaming
on an iguana.
Yes, on an iguana.
You know, you can't just drop an iguana into the conversation and then walk on by, right, Emiliana? Emiliana,
excuse me.
You can't just drop an iguana into the conversation and then continue speaking. Everybody's going, she said an iguana? What are you talking about?
It's just as laughable. Unfortunately, it's just as laughable as the government blaming the opposition for the situation we have. The truth is the government controls every single step of the consumption chain, from giving out dollars, from deciding who's able to import food, from fiscalizing every single wholesaler, from controlling all distribution channels, to controlling prices, to having National Guards stand in every single supermarket making sure that people are sold only the ration they're allowed. So how can the government blame the opposition or anybody else for what is clearly only a result of their failed policies? This government, the only way that we will get out of this crisis is if the government rectifies, and if the government can't rectify, then we need a new government.
How realistic is that, David?
Well, I think right now the opposition has the best chance it's had in 16 years to take power, which is what it's wanted. This year there are legislative elections that if they do well on that, they'll be in a great position for a recall referendum in 2016. The problem is that this opposition for 10, 15 years has had a sense of entitlement that they're not patient enough. They don't, they want to take shortcuts. They want to, so right now, instead of organizing for the legislative elections, instead of putting together a platform, an analysis, and suggest what they're going to do, they're pushing for Maduro's resignation. They're saying we need a governmental change. Why don't they simply organize for elections, like people do in democracy?
All right, I've got an image here to show you, Isabel, because you were telling us about how pretty much everything is scarce, and the image has just disappeared. But it showed where oil prices was budgeted for in Venezuela, about $117 a barrel, where it is now, which is $50 a barrel, probably a little bit less because of the nature of the oil that comes from Venezuela. Every time the oil price goes down, how is that explained to you as a citizen in Venezuela? How does the government explain to you why things may be difficult on the ground?
Well, there's no explanation whatsoever on how the oil prices are really affecting our lives. You have to have a little bit of common sense to know that the income that our country has is mainly due to oil. And yes, it's not only what's budgeted in Venezuela, the $117 the barrel, but also you have to see one of our main buyers has been lowering their buys redundantly to Venezuela at a 52% rate since 2005. Approximately.
So Isabel, every time if you watch the economic news and you see the price of oil goes down, and your reaction is what? Just very simply, so wrapping up.
It's a joke. They don't have any more money to spend on buying boats, because that's where the oil money is going.
Isabel Pisani is one of our guests today. We have David Smaldi, Emiliana Duarte, and George Chicarello Mar. They're coming to the post show, stream.aljazeera.com. Hope to see you there. Let me tell you about the next AJ stream, overseas adoptions. That's what we'll be talking about. And we'll tell you why many adult international adoptees are speaking out against the practice. Stay with us. The post show's next, stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching. This is the Streams Online Post Show. We've been talking about Venezuela's economic struggles amid falling oil prices around the world. George, do you get a sense that there's a feeling of panic in Venezuela right now?
That's what's being projected, but that's not something that I see. That's not something that I sense. I know that people
who's
are
doing
very
the projecting? Because it matters if it's the administration doing the projecting. We should take that seriously.
No, I think where you get a sense of panic is in the foreign press and in the certain sort of middle and upper class sectors of Venezuela, whereas people on the ground, on the grassroots level, people in the working classes, and especially the supporters of Chavismo, are frustrated, are wondering what's next, are trying to build alternatives, but they don't have this sense of panic that I think you get about Venezuela. But bear in mind that people have been spreading panic about Venezuela for 15 years.
Right.
So unfortunately, the reason why we have to resort to the foreign press in order to explain what's happening, this horrible crisis that we're going through, is because the entire media system in Venezuela is also dependent on the state and has been co-opted as an arm of propaganda for this government to, once again, do as it will. Repress, persecute, silence dissidents. Just as last year's protests ended in brutal repression, torture, and gross human rights violations, the government now can only resort to fear as its main weapon to silence dissent. Yes, there is a crisis, and it's only going to get worse, unfortunately, unless something's done about it.
So let me
Nowadays,
yeah, go ahead.
Nowadays, it's more dangerous to go out in the streets with a bag that has detergent, shampoo, corn flour, or whichever product that it's scarce on the streets, because people can really punch you and take your bags and rob you on the streets, and that has happened. And it's really unnecessary to say that products like that people shouldn't be on the streets like rioting for this, and that's what's happening on the supermarkets. And also people that are making lines are not also poor people, also middle and high class people. Everybody is doing lines, and mostly they don't know which line are they doing, but they're doing it.
Could I add in here a second that I think it is interesting that suddenly Venezuela is in the news again. These scarcities have actually been happening for a number of years now. They're worse right now, but the same thing happened in 2013 in May and June, also in October to 2013. So it's not unprecedented, but I think it's the combination of these scarcities in January with the fact that there's these long postponed economic reforms. There's huge economic distortions that have to be addressed at the same time that oil is now half what it was 6 months ago, and Maduro has 22% support. So he has to make big changes with fewer resources and little political capital, and that's a really, I think, difficult, combustible combination.
You mentioned big changes there. I just wanted to get in because you mentioned big changes. And so among the tweets that I've seen just in the last few minutes, people are still talking about what those big changes should look like. So Emiliana, one person says, most of these oil countries practice monocrop economies. With the fall in the world oil market, they have to diversify. This person, Kevin, says, how will they adapt as the world moves to renewables and tax carbons if they don't diversify? So Emiliana, is there a national conversation going on about what comes next?
Well, of course there is. I mean, there's been talk about lifting the subsidy of gasoline, and there's been talk about putting more to diversifying the economy and making this country more productive. But this all cannot happen unless this model of populism and petropopulism is until we get over it, and that can only happen if we are aware that regulations and controls only disrupt the economy, create opportunities for corruption. More than $25 billion have been stolen from our national coffers because of the exchange control ever since it was put into place in 2003. So only
Emiliana, for our international audience who are just listening in and find this fascinating about Venezuela, very briefly, do you want to explain what you just said?
So basically, we have an exchange control whereby the government can decide who gets access to dollars for importing goods. There's different rates for this exchange control depending on what these goods are. But regardless of the rate, the government is through its discretion, decides who is allotted funds after a very bureaucratic and difficult process. And over the past 2 years, Jorge Jordani, like I said, the former minister, the finance minister of Chavez, basically admitted that more than $25 billion had been given away to fake companies as a means of obtaining funds from the state and then not importing any goods with them. Now, the government blames the opposition for this, but let's not forget that it was the very government who imposed this system to begin with. So it's a blame game that always goes back to the government and its failed policies.
Sure. David, you said you've seen scarcities before. Where do you think this situation may lead to?
That's a good question. I think it really depends on what the government does. And I think the government has the lion's share of the blame here. I think, however, I think they get some credit for starting a conversation. Maduro, in his State of the Union address, said he's going to, there's going to be some sort of devaluation that's going to increase the gas prices. And in fact, there's actually now some public service messages with people talking about this. They're starting a conversation. The opposition, on the other hand, basically, they do, as they always do, whatever is the most expedient. They criticize devaluation. They criticize the idea of increasing gas. I mean, I think there's a long-term sort of expert conversation on this, but unfortunately, there's very limited political conversation on this. And I think actually the government's doing a better job than the opposition is. I think the opposition has to up its game and join the conversation and say what they would do. That the conversation, I think, actually needs two sides. The government's clearly going to have to push forward some reforms. I mean, what we've seen so far from Maduro in his 2 years and also from his speech the other night, it looks like it's going to be too little, too late. And so I'm expecting this is going to get worse before it gets better. I think it's really hard thing for Maduro. These policies were put in place by Chavez. Maduro gets his charisma. He was Chavez's designated successor. Very difficult for him to change policies, and become, be criticized as a neoliberal, as going against Chavez's legacy. So it's very difficult for him, I think.
Sure. Isabel, what's your next shopping trip? What are you planning to buy next?
Whatever I can find. I cannot plan on what can I buy next. Whatever I find on the market. I mean, I would try to buy a cereal, but I don't know which brands of cereal will there be on the shelves.
But you also don't have any milk right now, so maybe cereal without milk might not be the best shopping option, right?
No, I found 2 liters of milk that a friend of mine took to my home, and she called me on the phone and told me, oh, there's milk on this supermarket. Do you want me to buy? Okay, I can only buy 6. I'm gonna give you 2 of them. Okay. So she took it to my place because she said, when you get here, you won't be able to find any milk.
Wow. We're redefining friendship in Venezuela with who's the mate that calls you up and tells you what you need and buys you some as well. Okay, wow. Isabel Pisani.
I'd like to make a point.
Emiliana, I'm wrapping up. So can you make that point in a sentence? Because I'd love to hear it in a sentence.
Basically, there are democratic means. Of course, we want a democratic transition to a democracy, a part of the redundancy, and there are means within the Constitution for this to be done. And the reason why we're so hasty, meaning the opposition, for this to happen is because you cannot be patient during a crisis. You cannot be patient when it's so urgent and when this crisis might become an emergency of nationwide proportions.
Emiliana Duarte is a blogger at the Caracas Chronicles. We also had David Smaldy. He's a senior fellow at Washington Office on Latin America. Isabel Pisani is a student at Universidad Metropolitana, and George Chicarella is the author of We Created Chavez and also professor of political science at Drexel University. Thank you all for being part of this conversation. Malika, how did the conversation go online?
I think people had some skepticism. I'll end with this tweet because it's from a Venezuelan. Roberto says, the bottom line, and he's quite skeptical, Venezuela's chickens are coming home to roost. It's a cautionary tale for world leaders everywhere.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Moving on to our next AJ Stream show. Overseas adoptions is what we'll be talking about. We'll tell you why many adult international adoptees are speaking out against the practice. We'll find out why on the next AJ Stream. See you soon.